Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Alyssa Banford Witting. Dr. Banford Witting completed an undergraduate degree in marriage, family, and human development from Brigham Young University in 2007. She went on to get her master's in marriage and family therapy from Auburn University in 2009 and her PhD in marriage and family therapy in 2011 from Texas Tech University. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship and visiting professorship in marriage and family therapy at the University of Connecticut in 2013 and went on to be a couple and family therapy faculty at Alliant International University, San Diego. She joined the marriage and family therapy faculty in School of Family Life at BYU in 2017. Alyssa's research centers around rehabilitation from trauma, with special emphasis on mass trauma and the sociocultural issues which influence trauma symptoms and recovery in individuals, families, and communities. Alyssa has conducted research in Sri Lanka and with the U.S. with disaster and war-affected populations. Dr. Banford Witting will present on trauma and culture.
Okay. So it's been so good today to hear the developmental perspective and to think about that in terms of how it's going to influence our work with clients and trauma, and to think about physiology and the brain and all of these pieces. And so my discussion with you today is going to bring in another dimension that hopefully will give you some useful things to think about when you're working with your clients, and that piece is culture. And sort of thinking about this as an information processing system of its own, and hopefully this will give you a few ideas with your own clients. So my interest in this topic has sort of a clinical arm and a research arm. When I was first a master's student learning MFT, I was discombobulated, as many students are, felt out of place in the therapy room until I started working with clients who'd experienced trauma. And specifically clients who were experiencing some kind of emotional thing that was just unbearable. And I started to just feel really at home and calm, and that I had a sense of awareness, and like I started to feel like this is really what I want to do, even if I don't know exactly what I'm doing. So I want you to remember this picture of the trash can with the Kleenexes, and we're going to come back to that and where the Kleenex story comes from. And then I've got a picture over there of Sri Lanka. So I, as a clinical student also in the master's program, I was being trained in research and had to write a thesis and didn't know what I was going to do that about, but I had and still have just this sort of interest in calamity and when everything goes wrong on a large scale. And I had this sense of calmness and interest around that topic. And so I just kind of followed that. There was an advisor at Auburn who was from Sri Lanka who had some data from disaster-affected women that I wrote my thesis and dissertation with. And then I've since followed that track and have been to Sri Lanka a couple of times. And it's really opened my eyes to the importance of involving a cultural perspective in my understanding of trauma. So I'm going to refer to this experience a few times as we go through this today. And also I've chosen this picture and this map of Sri Lanka for a specific reason that I'm going to come back to again. So remember both of these pictures. Okay. So to start, I want you to take a look at this image as a whole, and just notice, just think to yourself about what commands your attention in the image as a whole, and what seems important, what catches your eye. Just kind of take it in for a second. And now this one, same question. I want you just to think about what seems important, what catches your eye, what stands out about this image as a whole. And notice if it's different from the image I just showed you before. Okay, so now here they are side by side. So I have two questions for you just to be thinking about within yourself. Is first, how important is the frame to the meaning of the image? That's the first question. And secondly, is it even the same image with a different frame? It's like very subjective, something to think about. Is it, as a whole, is it the same thing? But most importantly, just remind yourself and remind your eye before we go on, did the frame cause you to pay attention to something different in each of the images? culture is kind of like this. It's kind of like this frame. So I have this quote here about incorporating culture into our understanding of trauma. So it says, for comprehensive conceptualization of trauma, events have to be placed within a cultural frame in terms of beliefs about causal influences and consequences. So in other words, culture sort of imbues trauma with a meaning, and therefore it imbues our treatment with a meaning. And so if we ignore it entirely, then we can miss important pieces of both why trauma is devastating and what we can do about it. So let's talk for a minute about kind of putting a frame on culture and what I mean by that in terms of our discussion today. So culture, a lot of times we tend to think of it as equivalent to race, ethnicity, ancestry, and some of those kinds of demographic features, and it certainly plays a role and has connection to those, but it's more encompassing than that. Just as your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, fingers, and your emotions really are information processing symptoms, culture is like that. It is a filter through which all of our information goes and is processed and importance is assigned, and it's a way of making sense of the world. So culture has an influence on reality, meaning, identity, what we consider moral, healthy, what's illness. And it also has an impact on what we consider to be acceptable behaviors, which also means that culture has an impact on what are acceptable symptoms that we're going to get into in a little while. Then I want to put another frame around trauma that you might have thought about or not thought about before, but I like this iceberg metaphor where we have an emergency that's visible up top. And this to me is especially relevant as we think about sort of mass trauma events, like some of the shootings that our country has been facing the last little while. Things like wars and disasters, large-scale things that are emergencies, and that kind of tends to be what we see, what draws attention, what draws television ratings, what draws a lot of emotion, what draws a lot of assistance at the moment that we see the emergency there up top. But usually, and just about always, there's this whole context underneath the surface. And this, as a cultural being, this is probably the most important thing I've learned about trauma, is that many people face chronic complex emergencies that are rooted in histories of colonialism, oppression, poverty, and environmental degradation. So in other words, the one way that I would just summarize that is that the damage that trauma does is at the very least embedded in, and in some cases determined by, your sociocultural context. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me give you an example. So here we go back to my map. Maybe you remember this from before. So this is Sri Lanka. If you don't know where it was, I didn't until I remember finding it on a globe when I was a really young kid. It's a tiny island about the size of New Jersey right off of the coast of India. And so I had my faculty member at Auburn who was from Sri Lanka, and so we had this data, and so I was working with that. And again, I was real interested in the emergency. I was like, oh, these people were affected by the tsunami that hit in 2004. Let me learn about that. And that's probably connected to PTSD, so I can learn about trauma symptoms. And I entirely blew past a critical and central element of Sri Lankan culture that has since changed my entire way of thinking about the situation. So I'm going to make this brief. There's a lot I could say here, but Sri Lanka has a long history of colonization. So they've been colonized by a number of countries, most prominently the Netherlands and Great Britain. And so they were under some sort of occupation until the early 70s. And so as a part of that, one of their main exports is tea. There's beautiful tea farms in Sri Lanka, and they're really known for that. And so when the British were occupying Sri Lanka, they were capitalizing on that. So they brought ethnically Tamil people from India down to Sri Lanka to farm the tea. They were expert at it. So there became this divide. You have the Tamil group and you have the Sinhalese group, which are the people who are ethnically indigenous to Sri Lanka. And over time of the British being there, tensions grew between the two groups because the Tamils tended to be ethnically privileged. They had more work opportunities. They were just doing better. So by the time the British left in the early 70s, there was a lot of tension between the two groups. And it eventually came to a head in the early 80s with this terrible civil war that lasted from 1983 until 2009. 25 years of civil war conflict. So right there in 2004, you have the tsunami that hits and kind of disrupts the fighting and changes things for a minute, but then the fighting ensued and ended in 2009. And I still feel this sense of embarrassment around this. I wrote an entire thesis and dissertation without even mentioning the war. And that had huge impact on the socio-demographic changes. There was a rise in widow population, which has since become my research focus in Sri Lanka, is the widow population. And there was a lot of, the roads aren't particularly safe in Sri Lanka because there wasn't a lot of attention and infrastructure to pay to things like the safety of the roads when we're fighting a war. There's a host of other changes and poverty and fear and tension that's located within the context that has a huge, long-standing impact on the trauma symptoms of the people I was interested in that I had just completely ignored. So this is more for myself than anything. This is probably the best way that for me to remember that experience, is there's always things below the surface and they're bound in culture. So before I get into what we want to talk about today, it's important to kind of begin with the end in mind, that I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of concrete steps in terms of, for this culture, for this group, use these techniques. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But in the end, so there isn't a single best healing principle to apply across culture or for every culture in a silo. But really what we have to be thinking about for mental health providers, our role as mental health providers, is to just figure out how can we better fulfill our role while incorporating culture and recognizing that trauma symptoms are very culture bound. I'm going to talk about what that means. Okay, so where we're going to go today with a little bit more detail is talking about some cultural variation that we know about in the experience and expression of symptoms, and then just some principles for intervention that you can keep in mind for incorporating cultural ideas with your clients. Okay, so first, in general, just the frame that we have on the traumatic experiences that our clients might face are heavily influenced by society and culture. So culture and society might specifically shape what people actually feel has happened to them, the words that they use to describe it, whether or not they seek out some kind of help, and their expectation of whether or not they're going to get better. So I just recently finished working with a woman who was sexually assaulted 8 different times by 8 different individuals in the course of her college career, and had great confusion about this whole process. So she's sitting with me, and she's growing up in this Western culture like we are sitting here. And there's a lot of hype in the media right now about sexual assault and the Me Too campaign, and there's a lot more attention to it on college campuses. There's Title IX reform on BYU campus about reporting incidents of sexual assault. So I kind of have it lodged in my head that she must know these things, and that she must know how wrong this is, that this has happened to her, and she must surely know that this is not her fault. And that certainly hadn't been embedded there. And so she was really, her kind of presenting symptom that she was really wanting to work on was this anxiety. She was having panic attacks. So we start dealing with that, and then I kind of just start poking around and asking questions about her understanding of these experiences and how she made sense of it. And it became clear to me that, like Cindy was talking about, when we get those emotional flooding, it goes back to our developmental gaps, and we operate from a place that's far more simple than that, frontal lobe up front that's able to help us reason. And she really did not know how to make sense of this. Why would it have happened so many times? Why so many different people? She had some complicated questions about her trauma that I couldn't necessarily answer for her either, but I did know, and we were able to establish eventually that it wasn't her fault. But she had this real confusion about the consent process and whether or not this had been consensual. And then when she established for herself, no, of course I didn't want that, then it became really clear that we could start unpacking that this wasn't her fault. But it just had so much, for me, it was just another assumption that even though she was, in this culture where we currently have like a conversation about sexual assault, not everybody's enrolled in that conversation. We have to be really clear and careful about understanding where our clients are located within the society we're in. So the other piece of this is that we can help them to understand the influence of society on the script, to help them have a little bit more flexibility in their expression and resolution of symptoms. And that piece that I've just said about let's look at the influence of your culture and have some more flexibility, I'm going to return to that specifically. Okay, so talking about this from sort of like a diagnostic kind of DSM view for a minute. The DSM-5, which was revised 5 years ago, as you all know, changed the PTSD diagnosis from 3 clusters to 4. So we've got this re-experiencing, avoidance, negative cognitions and mood, and arousal. And then the ICD-11 will be incorporating the complex PTSD diagnosis that Cindy was talking about, but it's still under revision, which is really so needed. But the one piece that we sort of know from the literature that shows up in different forms, kind of across culture, so in that way we could maybe call it universal, is the re-experiencing portion, or in other words, the intrusion piece. That it seems to be that across cultural frames, that when people experience something traumatic, there is an intrusion component that's left over. So in Western culture, this often looks like nightmares, intrusive thoughts, kind of that classic flashback. They might experience dissociation, where we're just disconnecting from awareness to calm down and regulate. And then we have distress around reminders of the trauma. So some of the differences that we see, and I'm going to dive a little bit more into this, is first, intrusion doesn't look the same across culture. Even though we may have concluded that it is across culture and that it hangs out across culture, it doesn't look the same. Somatization is something that we see a lot more in non-Western cultures. So in Sri Lanka, after the tsunami hit, a lot of people describe their experience and sort of the aftermath as that as physical pain, as though they felt like the wave had physically hit them. So they had aches and pains and just a lot of soreness. So they actually physically sort of somaticized that expression of the trauma. And other culturally, it's a cultural appointed experience to experience like a possession, or to feel like there's a demon, or there's some kind of an evil influence that's around or within you. And that's perfectly culturally normed, and we consider that kind of part of that intrusion cluster of experiences. Also, outside of Western society, trauma memories are a little less disruptive to people than they are here. In general, or in sort of Western society, we really think about helping people to unpack those terrible memories that kind of haunt them. Whereas in lower to middle income countries, the larger issue tends to be that's more distressing is disruption in resources and social networks. We're going to talk more specifically about what that looks like and some of the things I've seen in my own research. So again, the difference is intrusion doesn't look the same. And also the avoidance cluster is the other one I want to spend some time on. This one's really tricky and has like the most slippery nature across culture for two reasons. One, it looks different and it's very culturally designated like intrusion. It has a different shape depending on where you are and what's acceptable. But it also has different impact in terms of whether or not it's going to be problematic. And that's kind of culturally laden as well. So let me give you some examples. So in 2007, there was the Virginia Tech campus shooting that happened, and there are two studies about that I want to briefly summarize for you about the dangers of avoidance in Western culture. So there was a study, an ongoing long-term study of white female college students. They were looking at something else initially, and then the shooting happened, and so they threw in some trauma assessment stuff. What they basically found was that the more the women disengaged, the higher their PTSD symptoms were. And that the disengagement seemed to matter more in predicting how symptomatic you were going to be a year after the event than 6 months. So in other words, the more disengaged you were, that was really impactful over time. And how they conceptualized that avoidance piece was problem avoidance. I went along as if nothing were happening. Social withdrawal, I spent time alone. Wishful thinking, I hoped a miracle would happen, kind of that, if I just close my eyes, this will go away kind of mentality. And the self-criticism piece, which is typically a part of the avoidance cluster, but actually doesn't show up so much as impactful in the mass trauma context. So in this case, is that this was something they assessed, but it wasn't a predictor of distress for these women in the mass shooting. Okay, so this could be things that you're looking for and thinking about in your own clients in a Western context. So what we know is that a lot of avoidance over time can kind of increase the heaviness of these symptoms, or at least it's associated with it. So another example of potential danger of disconnection and avoidance in Western culture is another sample of college students who were affected by the Virginia Tech shooting. What they found was that the more PTSD symptoms the students had, the more reckless they were, defined as reckless behaviors, so unprotected sex, driving too fast, driving while drunk or intoxicated. But what they found was really interesting is that it wasn't just the PTSD symptoms that were kind of driving the recklessness. It was more that the PTSD symptoms were sort of informing a shift in worldview, and it was the shift in worldview that was driving people to be reckless. And it was this, I feel less spiritual or religious than I did before. Life doesn't have a meaning. I'm feeling afraid of bad future events, or I'm feeling kind of out of control. So this represents kind of an internal, kind of structural, institutional disconnection from affiliations, religions, from cultural elements that give your life a sense of meaning. So what we're learning from this study is that it can be dangerous to disconnect from your ways of meaning, of ways of finding meaning, and that it can predict this recklessness over time. So those can be things that you can think about in the Western culture as you're working with, especially college students, people in that age group, of some of the risks that they might be facing after a trauma. So there's also some danger to avoidance in non-Western culture, but it looks different again. And it's less about spending time alone or kind of disconnecting from your faith and things like that. And it's more about like role disengagement. So Gayatri Fernando is a researcher who, she's a Sri Lankan researcher who did a lot of work after the tsunami. And what she generally found was that those who had a hard time long-term, years after the disaster, were those who were isolated from their social network and who were not fulfilling their role in the kinship group. So there was like a piece of responsibility that had been kind of abdicated that then held up the presence of symptoms long-term after trauma. So it was more, again, about social role disruption and less social support. So these are a couple pictures from the most recent trip I took from Sri Lanka, which is actually getting to be a little while ago. This was 2 years ago. And these are some of our collaborators and some children of mothers that we interviewed, or that our research assistants interviewed, because I don't speak Tamil. But we found kind of similar things in our own research about this in terms of like the disconnection from social groups and from social support specifically, and the continuing of symptoms. And it seemed to be for these women, when we asked them about their trauma experiences, you know, at that time the tsunami had happened 12 years ago and the war had ended 7 years ago. So we were asking them about trauma symptoms in connection with these two events. And for them, it was less about that over time. The things that were upholding their struggles were more about what the trauma had done to their context and less about like the dose effect of the trauma. So it became a lot of talk about not being able to get their child to school because the bus systems are not working well anymore. About their failing businesses because the economy has always struggled to thrive, and the war did not help any of that. And about like their gardens being attacked by elephants. There was fences that had been up to protect the migration paths of elephants that had since gone awry, and just everything kind of just went awry over the course of the war. So there was elephants leaving their migration paths and getting into their gardens, and in one case actually smashed a woman's house that was across the street from the interview site where we did these interviews. So they were really just living in this trauma-laden context that upheld just a difficulty in making it day to day. So in terms of avoidance, this is where we get into the place where it can actually be kind of a resilience piece or a way to survive. So what we found in some of our research is that when you're trying to survive, avoidance is in not really thinking much about the trauma or having some distance from it is actually an asset in some cases. So here's another example of that. So this is a study that was published in 2008 from interviews with Sichuan Chinese villagers after a massive earthquake hit and killed 70,000 people, and it had completely devastated their village. So this was a quote from the researcher's notes. And he said, "These were weird, unnerving interviews, and I don't pretend to understand what's going on in the minds of people who have suffered such blows and remained so optimistic. All I can imagine is that the history of this province had given these people a stripped-down, pragmatic mentality. Move on or go crazy. Don't dwell, look to the positive, fix what needs fixing, work together." So we might consider some of this like, oh, you're really overly optimistic, that doesn't sort of seem to match what happened to you, you're not in touch with the emotional experience of this. But in this context, it was actually really adaptive for that to be the case. And we saw that too with the mothers that we interviewed. They talked about, we don't have a ton of hope for our own lives. We focus on today, we focus on getting through today, we don't leave the moment, and we focus on our kids. We put everything we have into them and into the future. And for them, that was a way of sticking together and supporting each other. They talked about how we don't tell one another about our problems. It's considered It's culturally inappropriate to talk to someone about your problems when they have as many problems as you. So they felt comfortable telling us about their problems because they perceived that we were doing better than they were. So they didn't talk about it in the way that we would kind of encourage people to engage verbally around trauma, around difficult experiences in Western culture. It wasn't appropriate there. It was more about we continue to do and we take care of each other. And here's one other example of how avoidance can be kind of a resilient piece, kind of a protective factor. So this was a study published in 2012 of Bedouin soldiers who were volunteering for the Israeli Defense Forces. So without going into the whole political background there, I'll suffice it to say that these soldiers volunteering in that context, it was not approved of by their larger community. It was sort of a minority group of them that were volunteering for this military force. You can kind of think about it as like some of the larger cultural disapproval that soldiers in the Vietnam conflict faced here in the US. So what they found in this study is that those who had a PTSD diagnosis reported more intrusion symptoms. Those who were exposed, both of the groups are trauma event exposed, but those without the diagnosis were avoiding. They had the avoidance cluster symptoms, but they didn't meet diagnosis criteria. So in other words, those who were doing better in terms of the diagnosis were avoiding more. But this doesn't necessarily, that's kind of like puzzling because we have this other research that suggests, avoidance can uphold and kind of uptick other clusters of the symptoms and be a problem. But this is another one of those situations where culturally it made a little bit more sense. It was almost protective to do that, but why? So in the one sense, having that avoidant cluster of symptoms, avoiding thinking about it, avoiding reminders, avoiding engaging about it, kind of gave us safety from that community disapproval that they were facing. They weren't going to engage and talk a lot about it and kind of just go back to their communities and blend in, and that kept them safe from some of the disapproval they were facing. Also, their home culture is one generally, kind of like in Sri Lanka where things are more collective and role-based. So there's a culture of avoidance in a Western perspective where we're not talking a ton and unpacking the experiences. We're continuing to function, and that's where we get our support. That's where we get our connection. So these are some of the things where, I don't know, maybe that muddles everything more than it clarifies anything, but avoidance is a really interesting kind of cluster of symptoms. So when you're working with your clients that are dealing with trauma, it's going to be helpful just to think about what does the avoidance mean in the client's context. It might be really adaptive for them to avoid in their current situation in their family, or it might actually be hindering them and be one of those things where if we continue to avoid, it's going to start undermining other resources and actually cause an uptick in the rest of your symptoms. So it all just has to do with the meaning. It has to do with the context. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the expression of symptoms, we've talked a little bit about that experience. I guess it's expression and experience are hard to separate, but explicitly about expression, this idioms of distress, I love that phrase, and I always like to remind myself what an idiom is. So an idiom, usually we're talking about it in a verbal sense, where the words themselves, they don't have any really sensical meaning, but when you take the phrase and you pop it in the cultural context, it means something that have nothing to do with the words. So we have things like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or, I had another one in my head before this, but those phrases that they have a meaning, but what do you mean throw the baby out with the bathwater? It doesn't make sense. But in our culture, that means throwing an entire set of ideas out because you don't like one idea. We know what that means. It's an idiom. So idioms of distress can also be thought of this way. They're symptoms that if you look at it outside of the cultural context, it doesn't make any sense. But within the cultural context, it is an expression. And a lot of times those expressions are adaptive. So idioms of distress are culturally meaningful ways to attempt to address or adapt to pathological situations, and can include somatic complaints, like I was talking to about the feeling of physical aches after the tsunami wave hit in Sri Lanka. It can include the experience of being possessed or bothered by a demon of some kind, or other culturally significant experiences. So this is where it gets really tricky, because our job as clinicians, if we want to try to be aware of and sensitive to cultural orientation, then we have to consider two things. One, we have to simultaneously honor the usefulness and the adaptability of a symptom that might appear really funny, especially if it's not lodged in our own culture. So we have to honor that and recognize its adaptation, and sometimes let it be there and help the client to see that it's a helpful thing sometimes to withdraw or do whatever they're doing. On the other hand, we also have to look at it as something that becomes overly rigid at times. So let me talk about that for a minute. So in my MFT training as a master's student, I remember being taught like everything makes sense in context. All symptoms make sense in context. If you just take a look at what somebody's dealing with in their family system, then the way they're reacting is usually just some form of commentary. You know, you talk about like a child who's acting out can be a commentary on family structure. Boundaries are too rigid or too loose, or it's a way to keep the family together because the parents are having a lot of discord, and so they kind of unify around a child that's freaking out. So all of the symptoms kind of make sense and they have a function. So, and they all oftentimes, a symptom that appears rigid or appears to not make sense, or that we really target too heavily, can just be a way to comment on something where we are blocked from a direct resolution or a direct commentary about that issue. There's something that sometimes we don't have the power or the words, when we're talking about kids, we don't have the power or maybe the vocabulary to comment on something directly, and so we have a symptom, and the symptoms are very loud, and they make the comment for us. So some of the things that can block us from direct resolution or commentary that then result in symptoms can be some of these things, and I'll give you some examples. So kind of like Cindy had mentioned, when we're pulled back into a trauma, especially something that happened when we were young, when we didn't have the language to describe something and we're emotionally activated about it as adults, then we lose the language again. So this brings me back to my Kleenex story. I had a client who was in his mid-70s, and he and his wife came to therapy to see me as a graduate student. And he had been able to say that he'd had some really terrible physical abuse from his father, but we hadn't really talked about it. And I was a pretty young clinician and didn't know a ton about what I was doing, but I started to try to ask him questions about that and understand the history. And he stopped talking, and he put his head down, and he folded his arms, and he just completely went away. And I had no idea what to do. I had some sense that I needed to like engage his senses to get him back in the room. I think that somebody had taught me something about grounding, so I grab a Kleenex. And his wife, I think, kind of got him to open his eyes maybe, and then I handed him this Kleenex, and we talked about feel the Kleenex, talk to me about how it looks, how does it sound when you move it around, how does it feel, and kind of brought him back. But I remembered, I've never forgotten that experience. I can still see his face as he was looking down at that. It was like looking at a 9-year-old in a 70-year-old's body. And he was just having this terrible experience and didn't have the resources to talk to me about it. He didn't have the language. He also had a pretty profound stutter. And at the time, like being a new clinician, I knew that I needed to bring that in, but I didn't know how. And that was another thing that at that time and now was preventing him from feeling like he could take hold of language as a way that he could express that. So sometimes people don't have language or a relational system to handle the terribleness of what's happened, and so the symptom is there to comment on it or to disengage from it completely. Other things that block us from a direct resolution or a direct commentary on a terrible situation is having just a crushed infrastructure. And this, we see this in countries that are war-torn and refugees that are forcibly displaced, and people whose daily lives are just completely shattered. So in our research, we were holding a focus group, and we had, it was supposed to be a widows focus group, and we had 2 teenage girls come in, and we didn't say anything about it. They just kind of sat quietly until the end. And then somebody asked them, are you widows? And they were trying to understand who they were. They were only like 14 and 16 years old. And they explained to us that their mom had gone missing. And so they had, the economy is such that there's not a lot of opportunity for people to make money sustainably in Sri Lanka. And so especially when you're a woman, your options are to either subsistence farm, open a shop that sells crackers and cookies and stuff, or you can leave and go to, a lot of them go to Saudi Arabia to work as home workers and send money home. So their mother had done that. A lot of the women had done that were just sort of in the 20s, 30s age range. So she had left, and she'd called them 3 months before, and she said, I'm working in a brothel. It's a bad situation. I don't have any money to send you, but I'm going to as soon as I can. And that was the last they'd heard of her. And so they were trying to find a way to contact her. So they'd heard that there were Americans in town. And so they came to our focus group to see if there was anything we could do to help. And it was terrible. There wasn't a lot that we knew that we could do, but we had some faculty members that were local that were with us that sat and tried to help them. The process of trying to find somebody who's gone missing like that, it's just basically impossible, but you have to travel to Colombo, which would have been very expensive for them. It's about $6 to get across the country to Colombo, and then file a bunch of paperwork that they couldn't file. So they were just really stuck, and there's just these crushed families and crushed local infrastructures and crushed employment opportunities. And so there's just a lot of heaviness and a lot of depression that gets left untreated. And so how they deal with it is to function on today, focus on today, and to keep pushing as best they can and focus on very, very future-oriented. Sometimes there are forces of culture, and this is one of the interesting ones that blocks us from direct resolution and commentary. A lot of times our cultures give us a road by which to express our pain, and in other times our cultures inhibit us from expressing our pain. So this is a story I actually just read about as a graduate student. There was a Cambodian woman who, after the massacre there, she lost her mother and her father remarried, and outwardly she just kept saying that she was just fine with the remarriage, just fine with a lot of post-trauma changes. She'd have to move, the relocation, but she was being visited by ghosts and having nightmares. And they were so focused on addressing those symptoms, but there was not able to be any outward grief or direct commentary on the other losses that she'd faced. And so her symptoms were making that commentary on her behalf, and so they made a lot of sense. Also, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip details on some of these other ones, but we have other cultural forces that shape how and when we're able to talk about terrible experiences. Military culture has been mentioned. It's always mentioned when we talk about PTSD, but there's a lot of cultural threat around having symptoms and around exposing that you're struggling with something in a military culture because you might lose your job. I worked with a student at my previous university who studied the experiences of Marine wives, and they talked a lot about cloaking for them, and it was kind of trapped within the couple system, these symptoms that couldn't be talked about. It was hard for them to get community support, because if you did, then you might get fired. So there are a lot of forces that block us from commentary, so we have symptoms. So as clinicians, what do we do with that? And the idea is that we understand, again, how much of this is adaptive that we should honor, and the symptom is a way to express that it might be the best we have right now. And so we can just highlight that for the client. And in other ways, we might want to work with them on enhancing the flexibility around what other options they have. Maybe in your family it hasn't been okay to talk about your loss, but maybe it could be here. Would be an example of creating some flexibility around that. Maybe as a male, you haven't been socialized to have a lot of flexibility around what you feel, but maybe in here we can work on that. So some of those cultural forces can be lubricated a little bit in the therapy room. So just a few more ideas of things that we can do in a concrete way with our clients is to think about when we're dealing with trauma, have this overt emphasis on intersectionality. So if you may or may not be familiar with the term, but intersectionality is simply the idea that our identities can't be reduced to one of our demographics. So you're not just, it's not just your gender, it's not just your ethnicity, it's not just your class, and it's not just your historical experiences, but it's actually the intersection of all of those identities that create your unique experience. And so it's important for us, and it's something that we can do to overtly bring this line of questioning into the therapy room when we talk about trauma events. Did your trauma happen because of one of these identities or because of your intersection at these identities? How does your recovery and the way people talk about your trauma or the way you think about your trauma, how is that impacted by your race, class, or sex? So this was, again, something that I had to learn to think about. It was so helpful after I better educated myself about the war context of the women in Sri Lanka to just think and do a little bit of imagining about what life was like at the daily intersection of living in pretty extreme poverty and being having the Tamil ethnicity, which means you're the minority in the country, and that now the war is over, the two groups are kind of leaving each other alone. There's just not a lot of interface in the two halves of the countries. There's a big strip of tourist mountains in the middle, and so there's less of that tension, but there's a lot of meaning wrapped up in the way the war played out. It wasn't necessarily all Tamil people that wanted the war. It was an extreme separatist group, and there was a lot of kind of terrorist warfare, bombings, and so people have a ton of variety in the way they think about their ethnic groups' involvement in the war. And then also being widows. So another piece of the research that we did was to talk to them about their status as widows and how they lost their husbands. Some of them lost their husbands in the war, some of them lost them in the tsunami, some of them lost them to illnesses and other things. But there's a heavy stigma around widowhood. You're not allowed to remarry. And if you hire a male to help do something around your property because you can't lift something, then you get a reputation for being someone who's shady or sexually loose, or you just have it's just a bad image. In some cultures, widowhood is just considered a bad omen. And so you have the one trauma of losing your spouse, but you can't understand it and help your client to wrap their head around how they're going to maneuver daily life without understanding the weight of stigma that might hold. Just as an example, that there's meanings that are wrapped up in these trauma statuses also. Okay, so another piece to think of that we can actively be involved with in culture is, especially as generally Western clinicians, we tend to be kind of ethnocentric in our approach to thinking about trauma. Western terminology and diagnostics kind of overwhelm and dominate the global conversation. That is getting better, but our perspectives kind of go everywhere, and we have to be really mindful of that and just asking open-ended questions to help clients feel like they have the space to help us understand what happened for them. So I really like this quote. It talks about authentic help means that all who are involved in helping each other must, let me start again. Authentic help means that all who are involved help each other mutually, growing together in the common effort to understand the reality which they seek to transform. Only through such praxis, in which those who help and those who are being helped help each other simultaneously, can the act of helping become free of the distortion in which the helper dominates the helped. So this is something that was specifically live and important for me, going to another country where you're very visible physically and ethnically, and seen as like a researcher who's coming from a place of a lot of resources, and there's always this risk when you're going to another culture that, we're bringing all of our insight and all of our helperness to these poor people that really need our help and who are really crushed and dealing with all of this. And we can sometimes ignore their own resilience and just kind of get into this distortion of dominating the helped, and that's something I'm constantly trying to remind myself of. But some of the things how do we bring this into the therapy room today? To be mindful of power in terms of trauma and physiological response. We know from some of the childhood trauma recovery literature that when you look up at something, you naturally perceive the thing up there to have more power than you, which is why, I'm up here. I guess some of you are looking down at me, but then, we have judges sit up high, right? And powerful things are up high because it's size, it's kind of evolutionary psychology. So one thing that we can do just in general is to kind of think about the physiology of our clients and how can we not be threatening. Don't make people look up at you. I try to be really mindful of this with working with kids. Get on the floor and help them to not feel that they're being dominated. Also, I like to try to be really careful of the language that I select. A while ago, I started, and I think this is representative of the field, kind of move away from the victim language when we talk about trauma and more into those affected by an event or somebody affected by a traumatic event, being mindful of labels. And then also just inclusion, being really careful that we let people know what we're doing and why, and that we seek as much information from them as we try to give. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna not describe everything on this slide, but there's been some witnessing literature. Basically, Kathy Weingarten's studies the process of seeing and being with other people in their pain, seeing other people's pain and what that does to relationships, and how across cultures there's variation in how much pain we allow our close loved ones to see and be a part of. But the conclusion that she basically comes to is that hope has to be an active thing, and that it's far too important, the whole recovery experience around trauma and terrible things is too important to be left to an individual, and that we have to be in connection with the community, and in fact it has to be the responsibility of the community. So one of the things I've really learned in my research and in approaching this as a researcher and a clinician is that treating trauma is as much about health promotion and connecting people to resources as it is about treating trauma. We're dealing with the symptoms, we're helping people to manage the memories and to function, but it's also about connecting them back to life, connecting them to a context that works for them and is healthy for them and is full of resources. And we just can't do that. People just need community, they need their families, they need connections. And so when we take this sort of we must connect our clients type of view, then that might change some of the conversations we have with them about who they're not necessarily talking about their trauma with, but who are you connecting with? Who are you doing things with? Who loves you? What sorts of rituals and traditions do you have? Let's build a community for you. So the last thing that I want to talk about is sort of some wisdom that we have from cultural anthropology and some other fields about what it is what are the essential elements that help people get better from trauma. And some of this is based in community trauma research, but I think it has bearing in terms of the simple pattern in lots of different trauma therapies. So there are 4 elements that have basically been identified that have been pulled from indigenous wisdom and cultures all around the world that in the US does not as well on some of the community involvement stuff and the bottom part, the repetitive and pattern touch movement piece. But all really effective cultural and community-based moving through trauma has these pieces. So there's a narrative, so there's an organized story around what happened. And those of you who have worked with traumatized clients, I'm sure you know this, you can kind of gradate how badly they're being affected by the symptoms by how confusing their story is. And the more that they have something kind of organized and a narrative, you can kind of tell, and by the maturity of that narrative and how detailed it is, you can sort of make sense of where they are in organizing it. But organization and a story has to be kind of a part of getting through and making sense of a trauma. We also need some kind of a community involvement, a role, a responsibility, and a function. People need this to get better. They need it to be fine in the first place. There also needs to be some kind of an affective tone to getting through trauma. So where we actually access some of that emotion. Jessica talked about moving in and out of the red zone and the blue zone and kind of staying in that green zone. We have to be able to be emotionally engaged with what we're doing. And then lastly is this repetitive and pattern touch and movement piece where, again, other cultures seem to have more of this than we do. There's sort of a version of this. As the US has kind of adopted yoga as the way we do this, and it's rampantly gaining popularity in trauma treatment. There's a reason for that. That body awareness really allows some of the trauma memory in the limbic system to be connected with the prefrontal cortex. So how can we see these elements? So I have an example for you of a community intervention after the tsunami hit that I think is just so creatively brilliant, and like Cindy had mentioned, once you get some of these pieces, it's up to you as the clinician to creatively infuse them and find ways to do it once you have the principles. So if I were to leave you with anything that might be helpful for you to remember is these 4 pieces. How can you put these 4 pieces into what you're doing with your clients? And make sure that these 4 pieces have some kind of connection that makes sense in their cultural heritage. Okay, so let me read this to you. So after the tsunami, we found that the people of the village were afraid to go to the ocean. So this was a Western author who was visiting and doing some intervention work in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. So as most of them relied on fishing for their livelihood, this was a real problem. Because without an income, the routine, family and community life was disrupted. Instead of going out to work, fishing, the men just sat at home or wandered around the whole day with other men, which was a source of many other problems. So we met with one of the religious leaders of the village and told him that the relationships with the ocean are like the relationships between married couples. Sometimes anger is expressed, but afterwards reconciliation occurs and the relationship returns to normal. So the ocean got angry, and now it's time to reconcile. The religious leader liked the idea, and together we planned a ritual for the entire population of the village. He invited everyone to the ocean shortly before sunset, and while the people were assembling, the leader and I and 2 other people who were not afraid decorated a boat with lamps. We took the boat and sailed in from the ocean. All the people welcomed us, and the leader shared our story with them about the ocean's relationship with humans. Then the entire village prayed for peaceful relationships with the ocean. The next day, many of the fishermen returned to work, and most of the others returned to work in the following days. So I love this because I remember knowing about this and then reading this, and I was like, oh, how interesting. I'm going to look for this and see what kind of components were there. So the story about, it's like a married couple. The ocean got mad, and we had a fight, and now it's time to kind of make up. I mean, no matter which way you slice it, that was a way to organize that event that seemed to be helpful for the community. There was a community involvement. They all gathered. They were all there to witness this ritual. Then there's the affective tone, which is a part of the ritualization. Anytime we participate in something symbolic and ritual, it is affective, in part because it's physical, and it's shared, and sometimes it's generational. It's like a rite of passage. It has a lot of meaning, and so it sparks people's emotion. Then the repetitive and patterned movement piece. There wasn't as much in this story that was super overt to me, except that they came in from the ocean, and so there was this movement, and there was this whole ritual to it that brought this together and helped the community to start to move again back toward functioning in their community roles, which may be one of, again, those nuggets of important understanding about recovery from trauma. We have to find a way to go back to being meaningful in our communities. So the ending thought that I have to leave you with is that there isn't a model for cross-cultural trauma treatment. We don't have that. I don't know that we will ever have that. I don't know that that's even the right aim. But the things that I have learned over time is that what we have to have is a flexibility and an open-mindedness to attune to what we're seeing in front of us at the moment, the people and their intersections that we're dealing with, the needs and the specific symptoms, and how they translate, how they're adaptive and how they're too rigid, which kind of lays our clinical path for us, and then the background that's in place that led up to these symptoms that informs what they mean. So those are just sort of the pieces that I have to wrap this together, to be flexible and to attune to your clients and make culture a part of it the best that you can, in asking some of those questions. So that's all I have.